A boy stood in the center of the largest arena at Babel Academy. His name was Lee Seahun, and he was 17 years old on paper. 2,000 students filled the tiered stands above him. The judges had prepared a training dummy for his final demonstration, a D-rank machine, the kind first-year students always used. Seahun looked at it. He shook his head. He asked for the Model 8 instead. A hush moved through the arena. The Model 8 was a B-rank armored construct built to train senior combat students. Its plating carried mana-resistant alloy. Even fourth years struggled to dent it. The judges exchanged confused glances, and the head examiner leaned forward to ask whether the freshman understood what he was requesting. Seahun said he understood perfectly. Two attendants rolled the Model 8 onto the field. It stood nearly 3 meters tall. Red lights pulsed along its chest plate. Its arms clicked into combat position with a low hydraulic hiss. Up in the stands, students began to whisper. The refining kid was going to get himself killed. A few of them laughed openly. Several of the technology instructors covered their faces. In the top row, Vice Dean Michael Barmett sat with his arms folded and a thin smile at the corner of his mouth. He wanted this. He had wanted the demonstration to end in humiliation from the moment his son had come home 3 days earlier with a burn across his face. Seahun drew a plain longsword from his belt. The blade was unmarked, forged by him only nights before from ordinary materials. Nothing about it looked special, nothing except the way he held it. His grip was too calm, too settled for a boy his age. The head examiner noticed. So did an older instructor near the front row. Something about the stance did not match the face. The Model 8 lunged, and here, for a heartbeat, the story pauses. Because to understand what happens next, and why the son of the most powerful administrator at Babel Academy was about to lose the future his family had spent a generation buying, we have to go back. Not weeks, not months. 31 years. In the world Seahun came from, the sea kept rising. It swallowed the coasts first, then the great cities. By the end, only a single patch of stone remained above the water, and Seahun stood on it alone. The sea itself was no longer clean. Something moved beneath its surface. A black rot that ate at everything it touched. The scholars had called it the Swamp of Pandemonium, and the Demon Kings had cracked it open 30 years earlier. The world had never recovered. The heroes had tried. Seahun had helped them. He had forged their weapons. He had reshaped their armor when it broke. Across 5 ruined continents he had followed them, mending their gear in the dark corners of collapsing kingdoms. But one by one, they had died. The last had bled out in his arms, 2 years before the sea took the final coast, whispering that at least the world had lasted longer because of him. Now the world was gone. Seahun stood on the last piece of dry ground and looked at the corpses of his friends. He had dragged them here over months, all of them, because he would not let the swamp take them. The sky above him was the color of old iron. The water below churned with something that was no longer water. He did not weep. He had stopped being able to weep a long time ago. Instead, he sat down beside his portable forge. He set his tools out one final time. From his own left forearm, he cut a strip of flesh. His blood ran black now, threaded with the ore his body had become after decades of working the deepest metals. He fed the strip into the small furnace. He worked in silence, the way he had worked for most of his life. A dagger took shape between his palms. Its blade was thin and pale. Its handle he wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from his oldest friend's cloak. When it was finished, he lifted it to the dim light and studied his own reflection in the metal. He whispered its name, returned to the origin, then he drove the blade into his own heart. The last thing he saw was the sea rushing forward to take the stone he sat on, and the bodies of his friends going under. He woke up in a bed. The ceiling was white. A small window sat open above him. Warm air moved through it. Somewhere below, a bell was ringing in the slow, patient pattern that meant morning at the boarding wing of Babel Academy. Seahun stared at the ceiling for a long time and did not move. His hands had no calluses on them. He lifted them and turned them over. The skin was smooth. The fingers were narrow. These were not the hands he had used to forge 100 hero-grade weapons. These were a boy's hands. A boy of 17. Slowly, he sat up. The room was one he half remembered. A single student dormitory with a wooden desk and a battered wardrobe. On the desk sat a stack of enrollment papers. Today's date was printed at the top, entrance exam day, the one he had barely passed in his old life, scraping into the refining department by luck. For a while, Seahun only stared at the paper. Then he walked to the small mirror above the sink and looked at his own face for the first time in 3 decades. It was the face of a boy who did not know yet that the world was going to end. He began to laugh. The sound came out quiet and cracked. It shook his shoulders. Then it stopped, and he pressed his forehead to the glass, and for one short moment his eyes were wet. He had not just been given a second life. He had been given a chance to save every person he had watched die. Pulling on a clean shirt, he picked up the papers and walked out of the room. He closed the door behind him softly. The exam hall was crowded. Nearly 1,000 hopefuls filled the tiered benches. A long forge station ran across the front of the room, its coals already lit. Each candidate had been given the same block of unrefined steel, a set of basic tools, and 1 hour to produce a working blade. The instructors would grade the results. Seahun sat at his station and looked at the steel in front of him. Once, he had taken this exam terrified. Once, he had produced a lumpy, poorly balanced knife that barely qualified, and had crawled in as the last accepted refining student that year. Today, with the eyes and the muscle memory of a master, he could see the flaw lines in the block from 10 paces away. He could tell exactly where the ore had been quenched wrong at the mine. He could name the impurities in the alloy without touching it. Around him, the other candidates were sweating. A tall boy at the next station had already burned his fingers on the tongs. Another had tried to rush the first heat and now had to start over. Seahun watched them with something close to fondness, the way an old man watches children. Then he set to work. His first product was, on purpose, the same lumpy, poorly balanced knife he had made in his first life. He set it down on the anvil and looked at it. Then he raised a hammer and smashed it flat. The proctor at the front turned around, a slow, careful man with round glasses. He asked what the freshman thought he was doing. Seahun told him the first attempt did not meet his standards. He would try again. The proctor blinked, reminded him that each candidate was given only 1 block of steel. Seahun said he understood. He gathered the flattened remains of his failed knife and fed them back into the forge. Then, from a small pouch on his belt, he produced a handful of small red stones. Ignition stones. Refining students carried them to test the heat of a forge in tiny, controlled bursts. 1 stone raised the fire by 10 degrees, 2 by 30, 3 by 100. Seahun dropped 7 into his coals. The proctor started forward. Somebody shouted. Every head in the room turned toward the boy at the last station, and toward the fire, that suddenly leapt out of his forge in 5 colors. Red, blue, green, white, gold. Heat pressed everyone back a step. The other candidates covered their faces, but the fire did not spread. It stayed exactly where Seahun wanted it, curling in on itself like a slow serpent. Then he reached his bare hand into it. Someone in the back rows screamed. His fingers came out unburned. The old technique for handling 5-colored fire required exact mana control at the tips of the hand, and he had not used it in a very long time. Even in this weaker body, though, it came back to him almost by instinct. He pulled the flame across his forge like a length of cloth and folded the steel through it. The proctor stood frozen. 5-colored fire was a lost technique. The oldest textbooks named it as something the refining department had produced in its golden age, 60 years before. Nobody currently teaching at Babel was supposed to know it. The head of the entire faculty could not have raised one on the day he took this same exam. Seahun did not look up from his work. He folded, he heated, he shaped. When the blade was cool enough to touch, he set it flat on the anvil, tested the balance with 2 fingers, and slid a sheath out of his own pack. The sheath he had carved at home the night before. Narrow grooves ran along its inner walls, meant to hold heat. He slid the blade in and waited. Then he drew it again. The steel was glowing at the edge. His sheath had continued to warm the metal while it rested inside. The finished sword would now hold a cutting temperature for an entire hour without needing to be reheated. He placed it in front of the proctor. The old man looked down at the weapon, then up at Seahun, then at the exam board hanging above them, which was ranking submitted works by grade. Common, 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 uncommon, rare. Above Seahun's station, the light on the board flickered. Then it settled on rare. The room went silent. A rare grade weapon had not been produced at an entrance exam in the memory of any teacher currently working at Babel. Seahun packed up his tools without hurry. A woman in a slim gray coat approached him as he left the hall. She introduced herself as a recruiter from Babel Academy, the neighboring institution which had, in the past 20 years, quietly become the destination of every serious refining prodigy in the country. She offered him full tuition, housing, a personal forge. She said Babel's refining department had not produced a real blacksmith in a generation and was almost certain to be folded into the technology track within the year. His talent, she said, would be wasted here. Seahun listened politely. Then he told her he was staying at Babel. She looked at him as if she had misheard him. He walked past her. The truth was simple, and he did not owe her any of it. In his first life, Babel's refining department had been shut down within 6 years of his enrollment. Its master forge had been sold off for scrap. Its best equipment had been broken apart and stripped for parts. When the Demon Kings had come, humanity had faced them without a single true master blacksmith, because the last apprenticeship line had been snuffed out by administrative rot. He had watched heroes die because their swords could not hold an edge. He had watched cities burn because their walls were reinforced by contractors who cared more about profit margins than metallurgy. None of that was going to happen twice. If he had to save the world by starting with one dying department at one dying academy, then that was where he would start. Professor Kim Inshall found him that evening. Kim was a compact, tired-looking man of about 50, with a beard gone gray at the corners of his mouth. He wore the plain gray robe of the refining faculty. He had been the one to accept Seahun in his previous life. He had also been dead within 4 years, beaten to death by a pair of Barmett family bodyguards for objecting to an accounting decision. Seahun had learned of the funeral from a courier 3 weeks after it happened. Seeing him alive, walking, and offering a handshake was almost more than Seahun could carry. Kim asked if the boy would consider joining the refining department formally. He said he did not usually chase after freshmen. He said the department was in bad shape. He said he could offer little beyond an old forge and his own instruction. He added, quietly, as if apologizing, that the department was probably going to be closed within the year. Seahun told him he was already planning to sign. Kim looked at him a long moment, then nodded once, thanked him, and turned to go. At the door, he paused. He said the boy had a strange look on his face for a 17-year-old. Seahun told him it had been a long day. Hans Barmett did not like the look of things. He was the son of Vice Dean Michael Barmett, and he had come to Babel this year believing that the freshman valedictorian seat was his to inherit. His father had told him so. In its current state, the refining department had exactly 2 prospective students of note, him, and a nobody named Lee Seahun. Now the nobody had produced a rare-grade weapon on the first day. Hans sat in his private dorm, feet propped on the desk, rolling a cold glass of imported juice between his palms. He was a broad, well-fed boy with a habit of laughing too loudly at his own jokes. He liked expensive clothes. He liked being told he was clever. His father had made sure he was told that often. He asked his roommate what he knew about the new boy. The roommate shrugged, said the freshman was quiet, kept to himself, wore plain clothes. Hans smiled with no warmth. Plain clothes were easy to burn. The next exam was the alchemy smithing round, held in a large workshop attached to the main forge hall. Each student worked at a personal furnace, mixing metals with reactive compounds to produce composite blades. The technique required a steady hand and a careful eye for combustion. Seahun's memory of Hans's first life performance was very clear. Hans had rushed. He had ignored the standard cooling sequence. He had blown his own furnace apart in an attempt to embarrass another student, and the explosion had thrown shrapnel into the eyes of the girl at the neighboring station. She had lost the sight in her right eye. A Barmett family lawyer had quietly bought her family off a month later. Her name had been Louis Valent. Seahun's jaw tightened as he walked into the alchemy hall the next morning. She was not going to lose her eye this time. He would see to that personally. He entered the workshop early, before the other candidates arrived. Slowly, he walked along the row of furnaces until he found Hans's station. The furnace there was newer than the others, donated by the Barmett family, and Hans had reserved it for his own use. Seahun crouched and studied the seal at its base. He did not touch it, he only looked. Then he moved on to his own station 4 rows down and set out his tools. Hans arrived 20 minutes later with 2 friends and a cup of coffee. He waved at the proctor, winked at a girl in the second row, made a joke about the freshman valedictorian, glancing sideways at Seahun to see if it landed. Seahun did not react. The proctor called the exam to order. The task was to produce a heat-retaining sheath by fusing a base metal with a reactive compound of the student's choice. Simple in theory. In practice, most of the class would produce a warped, brittle result. The whole exam was designed to test patience. Hans had none. He threw his ingredients in fast. He raised the flame. Every few seconds he glanced across the room toward Seahun. Seahun was working slowly, folding his compound with careful, precise movements. Hans laughed under his breath and turned his furnace up another notch. Something in Hans's crucible began to bubble in the wrong direction. Seahun could see it from across the room. In his first life, this was where he had been standing when the blast went off. He had watched Louis Valente crumple with blood pouring down her face. He remembered the exact sound she had made. Today, Louis Valente was not even in this room. She was in the hospital 3 floors down and 1 wing over, being poisoned by a medical inhaler she trusted. Setting his own tools aside, Seahun stood up. The proctor asked what he was doing. Seahun said, quite calmly, that the furnace at Station 11 was about to fail. He recommended immediate evacuation of that half of the workshop. Hans laughed openly this time. He said the freshman valedictorian must be trying to disqualify him. The proctor hesitated. Hans's furnace exploded. Orange fire leapt into the air. Metal shrapnel scattered across the workshop. Students at the nearest stations threw themselves to the floor. A slab of the ceiling cracked, and dust rained down. Alarms began to sound. When the smoke cleared, Hans was on his back with a burn along one side of his face and across both hands. He was alive. Nobody else was hurt. The proctor was staring at Seahun, who had not moved from his own station and was already going back to folding his own compound as if nothing had happened. Hans's father would hear about it within the hour. Vice Dean Michael Barmett sat in his office that afternoon and read the incident report twice. He set it down. He steepled his fingers. He asked his secretary who this Lee Seahun boy actually was. His secretary did not have an answer for him. Michael Barmett smiled the same thin smile his son had learned from him. He said that was fine. He said the freshman valedictorian demonstration was in 3 days. If this boy was as talented as the report claimed, then the demonstration would be an excellent place to give him a proper test. He would arrange the equipment personally, and that was how Lee Seahun ended up standing in the center of the largest arena at Babel Academy 3 days later, watching a B-rank armored construct lunge at him with both fists raised, while the man who had bought the machine to kill him smiled down from the top row of the stands. The construct closed the distance in 2 strides. Its fists came down at his skull with enough force to crack cobblestone. Seahun did not step back. He shifted inside the reach, angled his hips, and drew the sword across his own chest in a single slow pull. 5 colors bloomed along the edge. The onlookers saw a flash. That was all. A layered ribbon of fire, red and gold and white and blue and green, uncoiled from the blade and washed across the Model 8 from crown to base. There was no explosion. There was no thunder. Only a soft, wet noise, like heavy silk being torn underwater. The construct came apart in 8 pieces. Its 2 arms fell first, still clenched into fists. Its chest plate sheared clean at the sternum and split down the middle. Its legs folded at the knees and toppled. What remained of its head bounced once on the sand and rolled toward Seahun's boot. Behind it, the far wall of the arena also collapsed. A whole section of stone, 10 meters wide, sagged inward and gave way. Dust rose in a slow gray curtain. Somewhere in the upper tiers, a girl screamed. Several instructors were on their feet. Vice Dean Michael Barmett was no longer smiling. Seahun slid his sword back into its sheath. He turned to the judges and asked, in a level voice, whether the demonstration had been sufficient. Nobody answered him for a long moment. Then the head examiner cleared his throat. He said the demonstration was sufficient. He said it in a voice that sounded like a man learning how to speak again after being hit in the face. Somewhere near the middle of the stands, a boy who did not know Seahun and had never spoken to him began to clap. It was hesitant at first. 1 pair of hands, then 2. Then a slow, rolling wave of applause moved across the arena, until the 2,000 students were on their feet, and the sound of them was louder than the alarms in the collapsed wall. Seahun bowed once and walked off the sand. The applause followed him out. Vice Dean Michael Barmett did not move from his seat. He watched the boy leave and thought, very carefully, that he had made a serious error. Then he thought that errors could be corrected. His hands did not shake. He had learned a long time ago never to let his hands shake in public. Below him, a small delegation was already gathering to take Seahun to the office of Academy head Ludwig. Ludwig's office was smaller than Seahun had expected. A single window looked out over the arena, and through it he could see the dust from the collapsed wall still hanging in the air. Ludwig himself sat behind a low desk with his coat off and his sleeves rolled up. He was a small, round man with a full white beard and eyes that missed almost nothing. On the desk between them sat a wooden bowl of sunflower seeds. Ludwig ate them one at a time, cracking each shell between his teeth and dropping the halves into a saucer at his elbow. He offered Seahun a seed. Seahun declined politely. Ludwig said the arena was going to cost about 80 million won to repair. He said this as a man might comment on the weather. Then he asked whether Seahun would be willing to help pay for it. Seahun said he would. Ludwig laughed. It was a genuine, tired laugh. He said he had been joking. He said the school insurance would cover it, and that the freshman valedictorian's demonstration was the most entertaining thing he had watched at Babel in 15 years. Then his face grew serious. He asked where the boy had learned 5-colored fire. Seahun told him a version of the truth. He said he had taught himself. He said he had been reading old refining manuals since he was very young. He said he came from a small town far from any major academy, and that his parents had died some years ago. Ludwig listened. His eyes did not miss anything, and Seahun knew he was being weighed. But the old man only nodded and said the story was as good as any other. He added, without looking up, that a boy who could do what Seahun had just done in that arena did not need to explain himself to anyone in this building for as long as he stayed. Then he reached under his desk and lifted out a small iron box. He set it in front of Seahun. Inside the box lay 2 objects. The first was a lump of stone the color of wet ink, veined with lines that looked almost alive. Its surface shifted when Seahun tilted his head, as though the stone were breathing under its own skin. Heavy ink rock. He had seen only 3 pieces of it in his previous life, and all 3 had been in the private collection of a demon king. The second object was a curved sliver of something that might have been bone, or might have been horn, pale gold and warm to the touch. Dream ivory. A trace element that could be woven into enchanted cores to stabilize any construct against nightmares, mental attacks, and one specific class of demon poison that Seahun happened to know a great deal about. Ludwig said the school had been holding both pieces in storage for almost a century, waiting for a refining student who could actually use them. He said Seahun was welcome to try. Seahun closed the lid of the box slowly. He asked what the vice dean thought of the arrangement. Ludwig's smile did not reach his eyes. He said the vice dean would think what the vice dean thought. He added that Michael Barmett did not run this academy, whatever Michael Barmett might have started to believe. Then he waved Seahun toward the door. At the threshold, Seahun paused and asked one more question. He asked whether the school kept records of medical intake for its second-year students. Ludwig looked at him a beat too long. Then he said the records were confidential, but that if a student had reason to believe a fellow student was being mistreated by academy staff, that student could bring the matter directly to him. Seahun said he would remember that. He left the office with the iron box tucked under one arm. The first problem was that his body could not yet do what his mind knew. He noticed it the same evening, alone at his forge with the ink rock on the workbench in front of him. He raised his hammer, and his shoulder ached before the second swing. His mana channels were narrow and unformed. His stamina ran out after 20 minutes of light work. The techniques he needed for the ink rock required hours of continuous, precise output. A 17-year-old body could not deliver that, not without help. He sat with the problem for a long time. Then he stood, brushed the ash off his palms, and walked across the campus to the sorcery wing. The UR department building smelled of parchment and old smoke. He signed a minor enrollment form at the front desk. The clerk did not look up. He asked which introductory class the boy wanted to take, and Seahun said he wanted the class taught by Professor Perry. The clerk did look up then. She said Professor Perry only took students who could pass her placement barrier. Seahun said that was fine. Professor Perry was a slim woman in her 40s with silver hair cropped close to her skull, and glasses that caught the light when she turned her head. She taught defensive sorcery. Her placement test was famous. Each candidate stood inside a woven barrier of her design and was given 30 minutes to walk out. The barrier used a family formula from the Inoue clan, a Japanese line of sorcerers who had been quietly renting their patterns to Babel for 2 generations. Nobody had passed the test in 11 years. There were 3 candidates that afternoon. A tall boy from the combat department, a serious girl with her hair in a long dark braid, and Seahun. The tall boy went first. He tried to punch through the barrier. His fists rebounded off nothing. Then his fists rebounded off nothing again, harder. He gave up at the 20-minute mark and sat down on the floor with his knuckles bleeding. The girl with the braid went second. She was Inu Erika, the granddaughter of the head of the Inoue family, and she moved with the calm precision of somebody who had been training since before she could read. She had studied the family patterns from childhood. She knew exactly which threads of the barrier held it together and where to press. She was through in 14 minutes, which was the second fastest time in the test's history. Professor Perry congratulated her without smiling and gestured to Seahun. Seahun walked into the barrier. He stopped in the center. He tilted his head slightly, the way a jeweler tilts a stone toward a lamp. Then he walked out. There was a small silence. Professor Perry asked, quite calmly, how he had done that. Seahun said the pattern had a flaw at its third layer where the mana threads crossed over themselves. He said the crossover created a resonance point about the size of a fingernail, and that anything walking through that point at the right angle would not be recognized by the formula. He said the flaw had probably been there since the pattern was designed, and that the Inoue family had likely never noticed, because their own members always approached the barrier from the front, which meant the resonance point sat behind them where their bodies never crossed it. Behind him, Inu Erika had gone very still. Professor Perry adjusted her glasses. She said Seahun was enrolled in the class. Erika intercepted him in the corridor as he left. Up close, she was shorter than she had looked from the test floor. Her braid was so long it reached the small of her back, and she wore the plain gray uniform of the support department with a slim wooden charm at her throat. She spoke very quietly. She asked Seahun where he had learned to see barrier resonance. He gave her the same answer he had given Ludwig. Self-taught, old books. Erika did not believe him, but she did not push either. Instead, she asked whether he would be willing to demonstrate the flaw again, in private, so that she could carry it back to her family and have the pattern corrected before somebody less friendly discovered it. Seahun agreed. Something behind Erika's eyes softened by a fraction. She bowed to him, a small formal bow of the sort her family used only among peers, and walked away down the corridor without another word. Seahun watched her go, and thought that he had just made his first real ally of this life without having to say very much at all. Dean Ryu Yunha ambushed him at the door to his forge 2 nights later. She was leaning against the frame when he walked up with the iron box under his arm, eating an apple. She was tall and lean, with dark red hair tied in a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She wore the deep gray coat of a department dean and no ornaments other than a plain silver ring on her thumb. The core of her mana signature was the size of a small sun. Seahun could feel it from 6 meters away. Ryu Yunha of the Borsipa department. S rank. One of the 4 heroes he had watched die in his previous life. He stopped walking. She bit into the apple and said, around the mouthful, that she had heard a first year had gotten his hands on the school's ink rock and its dream ivory. She said the ink rock had been sitting in Ludwig's box for 93 years. She said she had asked to work on it 3 times and been turned down 3 times. Then she looked at him with a friendly, open smile that did not fool him for a second. She asked if she could watch. Seahun considered her. In his previous life, Ryu Yunha had died holding a corridor alone against a horde of demon-touched. She had done it because her weapon had shattered on the 7th minute and she had refused to fall back until her wing was evacuated. Her body had been found with a broken sword handle still in her fist. If he handed her a properly forged weapon in this life, she would not die that way. He said she could watch. She followed him inside. She took a stool by the wall and folded herself onto it with the easy grace of a cat. Then, while he was laying out his tools, she reached across the workbench and picked up a leftover strip of high-carbon steel he had set aside from an earlier project. She turned it in her fingers. She sniffed it. Then she put a corner of it between her teeth and bit down. The steel snapped like a biscuit. She chewed it, slowly, with obvious enjoyment. Seahun turned his head and looked at her. She caught his expression and grinned, showing him a mouthful of steel fragments. She explained, unembarrassed, that her body had an unusual quirk. She could digest and metabolize weapons-grade metal, and her mana density rose in proportion to what she consumed. She said she was always hungry. She said the higher the grade, the better the meal. She said she was very much hoping he would leave scraps. Seahun almost laughed. He had not laughed in a long time. He told her she could have every scrap he produced tonight. Her whole face brightened. She sat up straighter on the stool. Then she waved a hand at him to go ahead and get on with it, and settled in to watch with the intensity of a hawk on a fence. The ink rock did not want to be worked. Its surface regenerated as fast as he could carve into it. Every strike of his hammer left a mark that closed itself within a heartbeat. In his previous life, he had spent 3 weeks with a similar piece, learning its rhythm. He did not have 3 weeks. He needed the bracelet inside of 1 night. He remembered, though, what he had seen in Professor Perry's barrier. The Inoue pattern had regenerated too. He had watched it flex and close every time one of the earlier candidates struck it. And underneath that flexing motion had been a rhythm, a 2-beat pulse, so subtle that only somebody who had spent decades reading mana flows could catch it. The ink rock pulsed the same way. He waited for the beat. Then he struck between them. His hammer sank into the stone. Ryu Yunha made a small approving noise from her stool. For 4 hours he worked, striking only in the tiny gaps between the ore's regenerations, layering black filaments of dark attribute mana into a lattice inside the rock. He called the technique Dark Curtain. It required the smith to weave a cage of mana around the ore's regenerating cells so tightly that they gave up and settled into a permanent shape. It was, technically, a lost method. In his previous life, only 2 smiths had ever mastered it, and one of them was him. At dawn, the ink spider bracelet lay finished on the workbench. It was a slim black band, no wider than a finger, threaded with faint silver lines that formed the shape of a spider's web across its outer face. When Seahun lifted it, the silver lines caught the early light and moved, ever so slightly, like a real web in wind. The bracelet's active property was gravity manipulation. Worn on the left wrist, it could double or halve the felt weight of everything within a 2-meter radius of its user. He set it aside and looked at his scraps. There were quite a few of them. Ryu Yunha sat forward on her stool. She looked at the pile of leftover ink rock chips and the trimmed dream ivory shavings, the way a starving woman looks at a plate of hot bread. Seahun pushed the pile toward her. She wept, actually wept, for about 3 seconds. Then she scooped up the chips and shavings by the handful and ate them, and her mana signature rose by a visible half rank while he watched. When she was finished, she looked at him with something new in her face. Not quite friendship. Something older than friendship, something closer to a debt acknowledged, she said, very quietly, that she owed him one. She said if he ever needed anything from the Borsippa department, or from her personally, he could ask and it would be done. Seahun told her he would remember. She left before the sun was fully up. On her way out the door she paused. She said, without turning around, that she had a running joke in the faculty about eating everything a first-year student produced. She said she had meant it as a joke. She said tonight had been the first night in 12 years that the joke had come true. Then she was gone, and Seahun was alone with a finished bracelet on the workbench in front of him. He slipped it onto his left wrist. The weight of the room shifted around him. The stool at the workbench felt like paper. The anvil, when he tested it with 2 fingers, felt as light as a loaf of bread. He closed his eyes and felt the flow of the bracelet's power settle into his mana channels like a second heartbeat. He thought of Jake Myers. Jake Myers was the combat department's freshman valedictorian. In the current rankings, he was above Seahun by 2 full grades. His combat class had been scheduled for that afternoon, and the class was taught by Professor Ricardo, a lean, gray-mustached man who was known across 3 departments for humiliating any refining student unfortunate enough to end up in his practice hall. Seahun looked at his own reflection in the bracelet's silver web. He thought that today might be the day Professor Ricardo stopped humiliating refining students. Professor Ricardo's practice hall smelled of sweat and pine wax. Its floor was a wide circle of packed sand, ringed by a low wooden barrier. The walls were hung with training weapons of every kind, blunted swords and wooden spears, and heavy iron rods for muscle work. About 30 first-year students sat along the barrier when Seahun arrived. Most of them were combat students. A few were from support, taking the class as a minor. Jake Myers sat near the front, with his arms folded across his chest and a small, closed expression on his face. Ricardo himself stood in the center of the sand, tapping the flat of a wooden training sword against his boot. He watched Seahun walk in. His mustache twitched. He asked, loud enough for the whole hall to hear, whether the refining department had accidentally sent one of its students to the wrong room. The class laughed. Not all of them. Enough. Seahun bowed politely and said he was enrolled in the class. Ricardo's mustache twitched again. He beckoned the boy out to the sand. He said that at the start of every semester he liked to establish a baseline. He said this by way of announcing that he was going to hit Seahun with a wooden sword, and that Seahun was welcome to try to stop him if he could. He said it with the smile of a man who had done this many times to many students and had always enjoyed the outcome. Seahun walked out onto the sand. He was not given a weapon. Ricardo raised the wooden sword and stepped in without a warm-up. His strike was a straight downward cut, aimed at Seahun's collarbone. The kind of blow that would have knocked a first-year sprawling and would have been described afterward, in the professor's own words, as instructional. Seahun did not step back. He shifted a quarter of a pace to the inside and reached up with 2 fingers. He caught the wooden sword by its blade. Then he pulled. Ricardo, still moving forward, was yanked off his balance by his own momentum. His grip on the hilt loosened for a fraction of a second, and in that fraction, Seahun's other hand moved. The technique was one Seahun had learned from an old woman in a mountain village 3 lifetimes ago in memory. She had called it first sight kill. It was a disarm meant for a smith with no weapon of his own, facing an armed opponent with only the first heartbeat of a fight to survive. 2 fingers on the blade, a twist of the wrist, a small lift of the elbow. The wooden sword was in Seahun's hand. Ricardo was 2 paces past him with empty hands. There was a very long silence in the hall. Seahun turned the wooden sword in his palm. He offered it back to Ricardo, hilt first, with a small polite bow. Ricardo took it. He looked at his own weapon as though he had never seen it before. Then he looked at Seahun. His mustache did not twitch this time. His whole face went strange, half embarrassed and half thoughtful, and he stood in the center of the sand for almost a full minute without speaking. Then he laughed. It was not a mean laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had been in his job for 30 years and had just remembered why he liked it. He asked Seahun where he had learned that disarm. Seahun said an old woman had shown it to him. Ricardo nodded slowly. He said the technique was called first sight kill and had not been taught inside a Babel classroom in 40 years. He said the last person he had seen use it correctly was his own master. He said the master had told him, before he died, that the technique required a particular kind of eye that could not be trained. Either a student saw the first fatal opening in an enemy's motion, or the student did not. He looked at Seahun for a while longer. Then he said he was going to write a recommendation letter that afternoon. He said he would send it to a friend of his named Ma Wang-Su. He said Ma Wang-Su had refused to take on new students in 15 years and would probably tear the letter up. He said Seahun should go anyway. Seahun bowed and thanked him. The class was watching in silence. Jake Myers had not moved from his seat, but the closed expression on his face had opened into something else. Curiosity? Maybe. Or the first edge of a decision. Ricardo turned to the class and clapped his hands once. He said that the freshman valedictorian of the combat department, Jake Myers, would now demonstrate a standard opening exchange with the freshman valedictorian of the refining department. Jake stood up. He walked out onto the sand slowly. He was a tall, quiet boy with square shoulders and unusually still hands. He wore no ornaments. His uniform was pressed and clean. He bowed to Seahun before he took his stance, and Seahun bowed back. Jake did not pick up a weapon. He did not need one. Jake Myers' family had produced hand-to-hand fighters for 6 generations. Their mana flow was so dense and so precisely tuned that swords tended to break against their bare arms. Seahun had watched Jake, in the previous timeline, snap 2 hero-grade blades across his forearm in a single afternoon. It was the reason the boy had been placed at the top of the combat department's freshman class before he had ever fought a match. The instructors had taken one look at his forms and given him the seat. Jake moved. He was fast. Fast in the way that comes from starting to train at 5 years old. His opening was a straight strike towards Seahun's ribs, with the whole weight of his body behind it, and Seahun could feel the density of mana packed into the fist as it came. Seahun activated the ink spider bracelet. The gravity around Jake doubled. For an instant only. Just enough. Jake's fist slowed by a fraction. His forward foot, suddenly twice as heavy, sank a full centimeter into the sand instead of pushing off. His whole body pitched forward at the wrong angle, and the strike that would have cracked Seahun's ribs passed through the air where Seahun's ribs had been. Seahun stepped inside the swing and set 2 fingers, very lightly, against the base of Jake's throat. Then he released the bracelet. The gravity snapped back to normal. Jake, who had been leaning into a weight that no longer existed, stumbled a full pace forward and had to catch himself on the sand. He straightened up slowly. He looked at Seahun. Then he looked at the bracelet on Seahun's wrist. Then he looked at his own hands. His face went through 3 separate expressions in about 2 seconds and settled on the last one, which was a small, tired smile. He bowed to Seahun. He said that had been a very good exchange. Ricardo made a noise from the edge of the sand that was almost a whoop. Later, in the corridor outside the practice hall, Jake caught up with Seahun. He walked beside him for a few paces without speaking. Then he said that in his family, when you lost, you asked the winner to teach you the thing that had beaten you. He asked if Seahun would be willing to explain the bracelet at some point. Seahun said he would. Jake nodded once. He said his sister was going to hear about this within the day. He said his sister was a 4th year and the top of the combat department overall. He said her name was Arya Myers and that she had a habit of taking an interest in people who beat her brother. He said this last part as a warning, without smiling. Seahun said he would remember. He also thought, silently, that he did remember. Arya Myers, the Sword Saint. 22 years old in this timeline, 4th year valedictorian, sole heir to the Myers family's higher combat style. He had seen her die too. Not in the same corridor as her brother, but on the same day. The two of them had held a bridge together for 6 hours, and she had gone down first, and Jake had held the bridge alone for another 4 before he went down after her. He was going to make very sure neither of them saw that bridge in this life. The auction was announced 2 mornings later. Every semester, Babel Academy held a public auction of student-forged goods, and every semester the Vice Dean's office selected which pieces would be featured. This time, the featured piece from the refining department was a white light longsword forged by Seahun. He had made it in an afternoon, with Kim Inchol watching over his shoulder, and Kim had almost cried at the finished edge. The auction was scheduled to open with a public quality test. The test was simple. Each featured weapon would be struck by an S-class white tiger fur cloth known as Seo Jumpo, which stripped durability from any blade it touched. If the weapon survived, it was declared genuine and moved to the auction floor. If it did not, the smith was publicly humiliated and the piece was withdrawn. Michael Barmett had personally requested that Seahun's sword be tested first. Seahun read the notice on the board outside the refining hall and stood in front of it for a long time without moving. Kim Inchol came up behind him. He asked whether the boy was all right. Seahun said he was fine. Kim said the Seo Jumpo cloth had been used on their department's featured piece 6 times over the last 12 years, and every time the piece had failed. He said the pieces had not been bad work. He said the cloth was a cheat, and the Vice Dean's office knew it was a cheat, and this was how the refining department had been slowly killed. 6 featured smiths in 12 years, all humiliated on the auction floor, all quietly withdrawn from the school within the year. He said he had watched it happen to a student he had loved like a son, and he had not been able to stop it. He said if Seahun wanted to withdraw the piece, he would support the decision. Seahun told him he did not want to withdraw the piece. He told him he had been waiting for this. Kim looked at him a long moment, then he nodded once, and did not ask any more questions. The auction floor was the same arena where Seahun had done his valedictorian demonstration 2 weeks earlier. The far wall had been rebuilt, the stands were full again, and this time the audience included buyers from 3 neighboring countries, half a dozen high-ranked hunters, and every senior instructor at the school. Vice Dean Michael Barmett sat in the top row. Beside him sat a small man in dark red robes holding a folded square of white cloth on a lacquered tray. Ryu Yunha sat 2 rows down from them, eating a caramel. She had winked at Seahun on the way in. Ludwig was in his usual seat with his bowl of sunflower seeds. The head auctioneer called the room to order. He introduced the first piece, the white light longsword, forged by Lee Seahun of the refining department. He read the description in a voice that suggested he had been told, quietly, to read it flat. Then he introduced the quality test, and the Seo Jumpo cloth, and the small man in the red robes stood up. Seahun walked out onto the auction floor. He carried the sword in a plain cloth wrap. He unwrapped it slowly. He set it on the low stone pedestal at the center of the floor. The white light longsword lay on the stone with its edge turned up. Seahun rested one finger, very lightly, on the pommel. He fed a thin thread of mana into the blade. Along the edge, an almost invisible line of aura condensed. It was so thin that most of the audience did not even see it. Just a shimmer, like heat rising off a summer road. Kim Inchol, watching from the refining department section of the stands, sat forward and did not breathe. Seahun stepped back from the pedestal. The small man in the red robes came down the stairs with his cloth. He climbed onto the auction floor. He unfolded the Seo Jumpo. It was white, almost blinding, the kind of white that hurt to look at. He held it stretched between his hands and turned to face the crowd with a small, proud smile. Then he lifted the cloth over his head and brought it down across the blade. The cloth stopped moving in mid-air. There was a soft sound, like a knife going through a sheet of paper. The Seojumpo fell in 2 pieces on either side of the sword. The pieces slid off the pedestal and pooled on the stone floor. For a heartbeat, nothing else happened. Then the small man looked down at his own hands, still frozen in the pose of the cut, and made a small, high, surprised noise in his throat. The blade on the pedestal glowed faintly. The head auctioneer approached with a handheld ranking crystal. He touched it to the pommel. The crystal flashed. The auctioneer's head jerked up. He looked at the crystal. He looked at Seahun. He looked at the crystal again. Then he lifted the crystal so the whole hall could see the reading. Rare. The white light longsword had been graded common before it entered the arena. The Seojumpo cloth, striking the aura condensed edge, had not stripped the durability of the blade. It had done the opposite. It had shed its own S-class mana into the sword, and the mana had been absorbed into the blade's core, and the sword had upgraded on the pedestal in front of 2,000 witnesses. Somewhere in the top row, Vice Dean Michael Barmett closed his eyes for a moment. The auctioneer recovered his voice. He announced the opening bid, in a slightly cracked tone, at 5 million won. Ryu Yunha raised her paddle. She bid 10 million. Someone in the front row bid 15. A hunter from the southern kingdoms bid 20. Ryu Yunha bid 50. The auction floor became a small, controlled riot. Bids came in from every corner of the hall. A collector from the capital tried to hold the room at 100 million and was outbid within a heartbeat. A representative from a hero guild in the western provinces raised the price to 200. Ryu Yunha, still eating her caramel, went to 300 without changing her expression. At 400, the collector from the capital dropped out. At 500, the hero guild dropped out. At 600 million won, Ryu Yunha raised her paddle for the final time, and the hall went silent, and the auctioneer's hammer came down. Seahun bowed to the room. The applause was not the same as after his demonstration. It was quieter, deeper. It came from a different part of the audience, the part that understood what had just happened, and understood, too, that the boy at the center of the floor had not simply forged a good sword. He had walked into a trap designed by the Vice Dean's office to end his career, and had turned that trap into the highest single sale in the auction's recent history. Kim In-chol was crying openly in the refining department section of the stands. The other refining students were on their feet. Ryu Yunha caught Seahun's eye across the hall and raised the paddle once in a small private salute. Michael Barmett did not applaud. He stood, very slowly, and walked out of the row without speaking to anyone. His secretary followed him at a respectful distance. As he passed Ludwig's seat, the old head did not look up from his sunflower seeds. He only cracked one shell between his teeth and dropped the halves into his saucer. Ludwig's mouth was moving, faintly. He was smiling. 2 nights later, Seahun asked Jake Myers to break his arm. They were sitting on the roof of the combat department dormitory. It was late. The moon was out, and there was a cold wind moving through the pines behind the building. Jake had brought 2 cans of a cheap fruit drink from a vending machine downstairs, and they had been passing a small paper bag of dried squid between them while they talked. Seahun said he needed access to the UR General Hospital, and that student admissions were tightly controlled by the Vice Deanery. He said the fastest way in was as a patient. Jake chewed on a strip of squid for a while. He asked which arm. Seahun said the left. Jake said all right. He asked whether Seahun could tell him why. Seahun looked out over the campus for a long moment. In the distance, he could see the lit windows of the UR wing. A single yellow light burned on the 4th floor, in a room he had walked past exactly once in his previous life, without stopping, without knowing. He told Jake that a second-year student named Louis Vallant was being poisoned by a member of the academy staff. He said the poisoning was disguised as a medical treatment. He said the girl was going to lose the use of her mana channels inside of another 2 weeks if nobody intervened. He said he had reason to believe that 2 other students, Gott Kruger and Pierre Barmett, were involved in the sabotage. Jake stopped chewing. The Pierre Barmett name did something to his jaw. He said he had heard rumors about Louis Vallant. He said everyone had heard rumors about Louis Vallant. He said she had been one of the brightest second years last spring, and she had come back from summer break sick, and she had not left the 4th floor of the UR wing since. He said the professors were saying it was a magical infection with no known cure. He said he had not believed them, and had not been able to say so out loud. He said he would break Seahun's arm right now if it would help. Seahun told him tomorrow was fine. Jake nodded. He drank the last of his fruit can. He crumpled it in one hand without seeming to notice. Then he said quietly that if Pierre Barmit was involved in this, he wanted to be there when the reckoning came. Seahun said he could arrange that. They sat on the roof a while longer. Neither of them spoke. Below them, the yellow light on the fourth floor of the UR wing burned on. Behind that light, in a small hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and old flowers, a girl was lying awake in a bed and staring at the ceiling because she had run out of things to do with the 14 sleepless hours of her nights. She did not know it yet, but she was about to get a visitor. Jake broke the arm cleanly at the elbow the next morning behind the combat department gymnasium. He apologized twice while he did it. Seahun told him it was fine. The pain was sharp and clean and passed quickly into a dull ache, and Seahun walked himself to the UR General Hospital with his left arm hanging at a wrong angle and his face pale enough to be convincing. The intake clerk was a bored woman with a clipboard. She wrote down his student number. She waved him through to the triage nurses without looking up. The triage nurse set the arm in a temporary sling and told him to wait on the fourth floor for a magical setter. She said the wait would be about 2 hours. She said this in the tired voice of somebody who had said it 1,000 times. Seahun took the stairs to the fourth floor. The corridor there was quiet. Yellow evening light came through the tall windows at the far end. 4 private rooms opened off the hallway, and 3 of them had their doors open. The fourth was closed. A small paper card was clipped to its frame with a name written on it in careful blue ink. Louis Vallant. He walked past it. He walked to the end of the corridor and back. He waited until the duty nurse had gone into another room to check on a different patient. Then he opened the door and stepped inside and closed it behind him. The room was small. A single bed sat under the window. A girl was propped up against the pillows with a thin blanket pulled to her waist. She was younger than he had expected, or younger than her posture suggested. Perhaps 19. Her hair was dark and had not been washed in a while. Her eyes were the color of a cloudy morning, and when she looked up at him, they were sharper than her body. She asked, in a voice thinned by long illness, who he was. Seahun told her his name. He told her he was the freshman valedictorian of the refining department. He told her he had come to talk to her about the treatment she was receiving. Her eyes went narrow. She said she did not know any freshman valedictorians. She said the door had been closed for a reason. She said she was going to call the nurse. Seahun did not move from the door. He pointed at the small object on the bedside table, a pale blue medical inhaler with a brass mouthpiece and a wax-sealed label. He said the inhaler had been given to her by Professor Weiss of the UR department in late spring. He said she had been told it would restore the flow of mana through her damaged neck circuits. He said she had been told to use it 3 times a day. Louis Vallant went very still. She asked how he knew. Seahun said he could smell what was inside the inhaler from where he was standing. He said the smell was not medicine. He said the compound in the wax reservoir was a slow mana eroder, a substance used in illegal duels to prevent a target from casting spells during a bout, and that it was almost certainly being fed to her at a low continuous dose to make sure her career at the academy ended without ever recovering. He said her damage had been healed weeks ago. The inhaler was keeping her sick. Louis Vallant did not move for a long moment. Then she reached across her lap, picked up the inhaler, and threw it against the far wall so hard that the brass mouthpiece bent. She began to cry. She cried the way somebody cries who has been holding on for a very long time and has just been given permission to let go. Her shoulders shook. She pressed both hands over her face. She made almost no sound. Seahun stood by the door and did not approach her. He waited. After a while, she wiped her eyes with the corner of the blanket and asked him, in a hard, flat voice, who had done this to her. Seahun told her the truth. He said Professor Weiss had been paid by Pierre Barmit and Gott Kruger to prescribe the inhaler and to keep prescribing it. He said the 2 boys had wanted her removed from the second-year rankings because she had been on track to unseat both of them by the end of the year. He said he could not yet prove it in a way the vice-deanery would accept, but he could prove it in a way the campus at large would understand. He said he needed her to trust him for one day. She looked at him for a long time. Then she asked what she was supposed to do about the fact that her mana channels no longer responded to her spells. She said even after the eroder was out of her body, the standard incantations she had trained for since she was 10 had stopped working. She said she had tried them in secret. She said her voice cracked on the 3rd syllable every time and the spell collapsed. She said she was not going to be a sorceress ever again, whatever this inhaler had been. Seahun told her the standard incantations went through the neck circuits. She said she knew that. He told her the neck circuits could be bypassed. He said there was a form of magic called tongue-refined incantation. a style so old that most sorcery schools no longer taught it, in which the entire mana structure of a spell was shaped by the movements of the tongue against the palate, rather than the vibration of the throat. He said the neck circuits were not involved. He said the technique was harder and the range of spells was narrower, but the technique existed. He said he could teach her. Louis Valence stared at him. She asked why he was doing this. Seahun almost told her the truth. He almost said that in a life she did not remember, he had watched her die in a corridor with a broken staff in her hand, and that he had never forgiven himself for not knowing sooner that the girl he had passed in a hallway once was going to be one of the last defenders of the Western Wing when the demons came. He almost said that if he could put a working weapon in the hands of every hero who had died in the First War, he would do it, and that she was on the list. He did not say any of that. He said he did not like watching promising sorcerers get poisoned by their professors. He said it offended him. She looked at him a while longer, then she wiped her face again and said, "All right." He pulled a chair over to the side of the bed and sat down. The first lesson was small. He had her rest her tongue against the back of her top teeth and hum. Then he had her shift the position of her tongue by the width of a hair and hum again. The tone changed. She heard it. Her eyes widened by a fraction. He said the whole method was built on that shift. He walked her through the base structure of a first-tier light spell. Tongue at the ridge behind the top teeth for the ignition. A soft click of the tip against the palate for the release. A slow drag along the roof of the mouth for the shape. She tried it. Her first attempt produced nothing. Her second attempt produced a spark the size of a grain of rice that hovered above her palm for half a heartbeat before fading. She stared at the spark. She tried it again. This time the spark held. It grew. It rose off her palm into a small floating ball of pale yellow light the size of a walnut. She began to laugh. The laugh was raw and wet and disbelieving. It came out of her chest in short, uneven bursts, and she pressed one hand over her mouth to stop it and could not. The light hung above her other palm and threw a warm color across her face. She looked at Seahun through the light. Her eyes were shining. Her whole body had straightened in the bed without her seeming to notice. She asked, in a whisper, whether she could try a larger one. He said she could. 2 hours later, Louis Valent was sitting cross-legged on the bed with a mana orb the size of a melon floating above her lap. It was pale gold and slowly rotating. It cast a soft light across the whole room. Her cheeks were flushed. Her breath was fast but even. She had cast the orb without a single crack of her voice, because her voice had not been involved. She looked at Seahun. She said, very quietly, that she had thought she was going to die in this room. Seahun told her she was not going to die in this room. She dispersed the orb with a small movement of her tongue. She sat with her hands in her lap for a while. Then she looked at him with a face that had a new kind of hardness in it, an adult hardness, the kind that grows into a person after a long, slow injustice has finally been named. She asked what he wanted her to do. Seahun told her. The public forum of Babel Academy was a wide board of enchanted parchment mounted on the wall of the main quad. Any student could post to it. Posts were signed. Most posts were minor. Someone had lost a training glove. Someone was selling a used practice sword. Someone was looking for a study partner in third-tier alchemy. At 9 in the evening, a new post appeared at the top of the board. The post was signed by Louis Valent of the UR department. It said that Louis Valent formally challenged Gott Kruger of the UR department to a public duel at the main martial arts hall at noon on the following day. It said the duel was for cause. It said the cause would be made public at the duel. It said that under Academy rules, a challenge for cause could not be declined by the challenged party without a public statement of refusal, and that a public statement of refusal would be entered permanently into the challenged party's record. The post was co-signed by a second name, Lee Seahun of the refining department. The board reacted the way it always reacted to something interesting. Within 20 minutes, half the campus had seen the post. Within an hour, students were gathered in front of the board in a small crowd, reading it aloud to each other in disbelief. A second-year sorceress, who had not been seen outside the hospital in months, had come back to challenge one of the top students of her department, and the freshman valedictorian of the refining department, the boy who had cut a B-rank robot in half and turned a rigged auction into a 600 million won sale, had co-signed the challenge. By 10 o'clock, the odds being quietly whispered across the dorms had swung twice. Gott Kruger heard about the post at 10:15. He was in his private room in the UR upper dormitory, half drunk on wine that a fourth year had given him, when Pierre Barmett burst through the door without knocking. Pierre was pale. He was holding a copy of the forum post in one hand. He shoved it into Gott Kruger's chest and told him to read it, and then told him to read it again. Gott Kruger read it. He read it again. Then he stood up so fast that the chair behind him fell over. He said Louis Vallant could not have written this. He said Louis Vallant could not sit up in bed without help. He said his mother's own physician had assured him a week ago that the girl's mana channels were destroyed beyond repair. He said the challenge had to be a trick. He said someone had forged the post. Pierre Barmit shook his head. He said he had already checked. He said the post carried Louis Vallant's authenticated signature. He said the signature could not be forged. He said the co-signer's name was also authenticated. He said the freshman valedictorian of the refining department had put his name on the challenge with his own hand. Gott Kruger sat back down slowly. He picked up his wine. He drank the whole glass in one long swallow. Then he set the glass down and said a very ugly word. He said if Louis Vallant walked into that martial arts hall tomorrow and cast a single working spell in front of a public audience, everything they had spent the last 6 months building would fall apart. Professor Weiss would be investigated. Weiss would name them within an hour of an investigation opening. Pierre's father, the vice dean, would not be able to protect them from a full inquiry once the girl's name was in the record. He said they were going to be expelled. He said they were going to be expelled, and then they were going to be dragged through the courts, and then they were going to be quietly killed by their own families for the shame of it. Pierre Barmit sat down across from him. He did not disagree. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the girl could not walk into that martial arts hall tomorrow. Gott Kruger looked up at him. Pierre Barmit's face had changed. The paleness was gone. Something colder had taken its place. He looked, very briefly, like his father. He said he had a cousin in the third-year combat department who owed the family a favor. He said the cousin had contacts among a class of visitor who did not officially exist on campus, but who could be called in for a fee. He said the visitors specialized in the kind of accident that happened to a sick girl on her way from a hospital wing to a martial arts hall, a fall from a stairwell, a carriage in the wrong lane, a fire that started in the wrong wing at the wrong hour. He said the girl would not need to be killed, only prevented. He said the freshman valedictorian was the second problem, and the second problem was harder, because the boy had powerful people already paying attention to him, but he said the boy could be delayed. He said an anonymous complaint about a first-year handling S-class materials without authorization could tie the boy up in the vice deanery for a full day. He said that by the time the boy came out of that meeting, the martial arts hall would be empty, and Louis Vallant would be back in a hospital bed, and the public would be told that the challenger had been unable to attend for medical reasons. The challenge would collapse. The forum post would be forgotten within a week. Weiss would keep his job. Louis Vallant would keep dying. And the two of them would keep their positions. Gott Kruger listened without interrupting. When Pierre Barmit was done, Gott Kruger looked at him for a long moment. Then he asked how much the visitors would cost. Pierre Barmit named a figure. Gott Kruger did not blink at it. He said he could have the money moved by morning. Pierre Barmit nodded. He stood up. He walked to the door. At the door he paused and turned, and told Gott Kruger not to worry. He said his father had always taught him that the difference between a Barmit and everybody else was that a Barmit understood a very simple truth about the world. He said the truth was that a fight only mattered if both sides showed up. Then he stepped out into the corridor and closed the door softly behind him. Gott Kruger sat alone with the empty wine glass. Outside his window, the yellow lamps of the campus were coming on one by one. Somewhere on the far side of the quad, in a hospital room that was no longer as quiet as it had been a week ago, a girl was sitting on the edge of her bed and practicing the small shifts of her tongue against the roof of her mouth, over and over, feeling a golden light bloom and fade against her palm, and thinking that tomorrow at noon she was going to walk into a room full of witnesses and destroy the man who had tried to erase her. She did not know that a carriage was going to be arranged for the road she would take to get there. She did not know that a complaint was going to be filed against the boy who had promised to walk beside her. She did not know, because Seahun had not yet told her, that the boy walking beside her had lived once before, had watched her die, and had come back a very long way to make sure she did not die again. He was about to find out, though, that even a man who had come back from the end of the world could still be caught off guard by the small, ordinary cruelty of two frightened boys with a rich father and a working phone number. The lamps came on across the quad. The forum post glowed at the top of the board. Somewhere, A carriage driver picked up a message from a hand he did not recognize, and read the address, and nodded once, and put the message in the fire. Noon was 13 hours away,